Help! Is anyone there? I can't hold on!
While every other animal fled the storm's devastation, one massive black stallion refused to leave. Amidst crashing debris and howling winds, he risked everything to guard the person who once saved him. This is the incredible story of a horse who chose loyalty over the call of freedom. This is a story about the moment when an animal decides that loyalty matters more than survival. Hit like and subscribe before we begin, because this one will leave you speechless. Drop your country in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. Thomas ran a small horse sanctuary on the Carolina coast. He had been rescuing abused and neglected horses for 12 years, giving them a second chance at life on 20 acres of pasture that backed up to the marshlands. Most of the horses he saved were broken in spirit when they arrived. Starved, beaten, abandoned. Thomas gave them time and space and patience, and slowly, they remembered what it meant to be horses again. 3 years ago, Thomas had rescued a black stallion from a neglect case so severe that the authorities weren't sure the horse would survive the night. The stallion had been chained in a flooded barn for months, standing in waste, fed sporadically, left to die. When Thomas arrived, the stallion was skeletal and wild with fear and pain. Thomas named him Dominion, and he spent 18 months bringing him back from the edge. Now, Dominion was healthy and powerful, a massive animal with a coal-black coat and intelligent eyes that followed Thomas everywhere. He had healed. He trusted again. And when Thomas walked into the pasture, Dominion would come to him immediately, pressing his nose against Thomas's chest, breathing in his scent, remembering the man who had saved him. The hurricane warning came 3 days before the storm hit. Category 4, projected to make landfall directly over their stretch of coast. Mandatory evacuation orders were issued for the entire county. Thomas made the decision quickly. He would trailer the horses inland to a boarding facility 50 miles away, wait out the storm, and return when it was safe. He loaded all 12 horses over 2 days, all except Dominion. Dominion refused to load. He would walk up to the trailer, then back away, snorting, his body tense. Thomas tried everything: gentle coaxing, treats, leading another horse in first. Nothing worked. Dominion would not get into that trailer. Tom was running out. The storm was 18 hours away. Thomas made a choice he would regret for the rest of his life. He decided to leave Dominion in the reinforced barn with enough food and water to last a week, believing the structure would hold and that Dominion would be safer there than being forced into a trailer in a panic. Thomas secured the barn doors, checked the latches twice, and drove inland with the other horses as the sky darkened and the wind began to rise. The hurricane hit at 2 in the morning. It was worse than the forecast predicted. Winds reached 160 miles per hour. Storm surge flooded the coast. Trees snapped like twigs. Buildings collapsed. And Thomas, sheltering 50 miles inland, couldn't stop thinking about Dominion alone in that barn. When the eye of the storm passed at dawn, Thomas didn't wait for the all clear. He got in his truck and drove toward the sanctuary through flooded roads and down power lines and debris fields that looked like war zones. It took him 3 hours to cover 30 miles. The last 10 miles were impassable by vehicle. Thomas abandoned his truck and ran. What he found when he reached the sanctuary made his heart stop. The barn was gone, completely destroyed. The fences were shattered. Trees had fallen across the property. The pasture was flooded, water 3 feet deep in places, still rising from the storm surge. And there was no sign of Dominion anywhere. Thomas waded into the water, calling Dominion's name, his voice raw against the howling wind that still gusted in the storm's aftermath. He searched the pasture. He searched the tree line. He was moving toward the marshlands when he heard it. A sound, low and urgent, coming from behind the collapsed storage shed near the edge of the property. Thomas ran. What he found there would stay with him for the rest of his life. Dominion was standing in chest-deep floodwater, his massive body positioned between Thomas's overturned equipment trailer and the wind. His head was low, his legs braced, his entire body acting as a shield against the debris still flying through the air. And beneath him, Pinned partially under a fallen beam, but protected by Dominion's stance, was Thomas. Thomas had no memory of how he had ended up there. Later, he would piece it together. He had arrived at the sanctuary earlier than he thought. In the chaos of the storm, he had been struck by flying debris. The beam had fallen, and somehow, Dominion had found him. Dominion had stood over Thomas through the worst of the hurricane, through winds that should have driven any animal to flee, through rising water that reached his chest, through debris that slammed into his body, leaving cuts and bruises along his flanks and shoulders. Dominion had planted himself and refused to move, using his bulk to break the wind, his body to deflect the wreckage, his presence to keep Thomas from drowning as the water rose. A flight animal, a creature whose every instinct screamed to run from danger. And he had stayed. Thomas tried to move, and pain exploded through his leg. The beam had him pinned. He couldn't feel his foot. He called to Dominion, his voice weak, and Dominion turned his head and looked at him with eyes that held exhaustion and determination in equal measure. Thomas told him to go, told him to run, told him to save himself. Dominion didn't move. They stayed like that for 2 more hours. Thomas drifting in and out of consciousness, the pain overwhelming, the cold water draining his strength, and Dominion standing guard, unmovable, his body between Thomas and the storm. When the rescue teams finally reached the sanctuary, they found them together. The massive black stallion standing in floodwater, cuts bleeding down his sides, his legs trembling with exhaustion, and the man beneath him, barely conscious, pinned by debris, alive only because the horse had refused to leave. It took 4 people to convince Dominion to move. He fought them at first, snorting, stamping, unwilling to step away from Thomas. Only when Thomas spoke his name, when Thomas told him it was okay, did Dominion finally shift his weight and allow the rescuers access. They pulled Thomas free. His leg was shattered in 3 places. He had hypothermia. He had been moments away from drowning when they arrived. The medics said if he had been alone any longer, he wouldn't have made it. But he hadn't been alone. Dominion had made sure of that. They transported Thomas to the hospital. They transported Dominion to an emergency veterinary facility. Both survived. Both would carry scars from that night. Thomas would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Dominion would have a long scar across his shoulder where a piece of metal had cut deep. When Thomas was released from the hospital 6 weeks later, the first place he went was to see Dominion. The stallion was in a temporary stall at a facility inland, his wounds healing, his strength returning. Thomas walked up to the stall slowly, leaning on crutches, his legs still in a cast. Dominion lifted his head when he saw him, and then he walked to the stall door and pressed his forehead against Thomas's chest. Thomas stood there with his hand on Dominion's neck and cried, not from pain, from gratitude, from the overwhelming understanding that this horse had chosen him over freedom, had chosen loyalty over survival, had stood in a hurricane and said no to every instinct that told him to run. Someone asked Thomas later why he thought Dominion had stayed. Thomas said he didn't know for certain, but he thought maybe it was because 3 years ago, when Dominion was chained and dying, Thomas had chosen to stay too, had refused to give up, had stood between Dominion and death and said no. Maybe Dominion remembered that. Maybe, in the only way a horse can, he decided to return the favor. Love and loyalty don't always make sense. They don't follow logic or self-preservation. Sometimes they just are. And sometimes they're strong enough to stand against a hurricane. Thomas saved Dominion 3 years ago. And when it mattered most, Dominion saved him back. Not because he had to, because he chose to. That's the power of the bond between a human and an animal who truly see each other. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in loyalty that runs deeper than words. Subscribe so you never miss these incredible stories. And drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed an animal choose love over survival?